Hello, I'm Graham Knop. Also Harg on IRC and GitHub and elsewhere. I work for Booking.com, which nice enough to send me here. And they are hiring, by the way, if anyone wants a Perl job. So in the Perl community, we have a pretty long history of doing a lot of testing. Tools like test more and prove have been around for a long time and allowed people to test their code in good ways. We also have CPAN Testers is a site that's been around for a long time and is an important part of that. So CPAN Testers is test reporting for CPAN releases that are uploaded to CPAN. Some of that is automated testing done by people running dedicated smoking machines that just test everything. Other things is done by individual users. As they install things, they'll submit reports through that. It also you'll get test reports for development releases and trial releases that you upload that aren't meant to be installed for general use, but you still are able to get testing ahead of time with something like that. There's some issues with that model, though. First of all, not everything is on CPAN. There's plenty of Perl projects that don't get uploaded to CPAN or aren't a module like that. Also, releases aren't always granular enough. Doing a full release to get testing results isn't always enough to get kind of full coverage on issues. Also, the actual amount of testing that'll do, if you have some kind of special extended testing or something based on external prerequisites, it isn't always going to be possible to do in a general test suite that's the same thing run when people install. So a good solution for this is continuous integration, where you test every commit that you make as you upload to GitHub or wherever else. Or additionally, this usually is paired with testing PRs. So if somebody submits a patch to you, it automatically runs through your test suite as well. This gives you a lot more control over your test process for, again, things like external dependencies, able to set them up ahead of time so that that'll all work. You can also link these kinds of things into the GitHub UI. It'll show up on PRs and such, anything of that. You can use it for merge control on GitHub as well. Have things that'll it won't let you merge it until it passes your tests and such. So one of the best ones for using this for Perl projects is Travis-CI. So Travis-CI is a free a project that is free for open source code, basically. Anything you put on GitHub, you can run through Travis without paying for anything. Integrates well with GitHub as well on kind of both sides. There's also, you can actually pay for Travis-CI instances as well if you want to do that for private repositories that are on GitHub. So how do you actually set up Travis-CI and use it? It's pretty simple. You create a .travis.yaml file in your repository, and you tell it what to test, which a very simple one. You just tell it you're testing Perl, and you want to test on these Perl versions, and you just give it a list of versions. And then you go into the user interface, and it's pretty simple. There's just a button, a toggle. You turn it on saying, test this. And then as you push code, you'll get feedback, or you'll be able to look at all of the different test results for every commit. If you dig into that a bit more, we see that there are, for every Perl version that I listed, you can see a build log of the thing, which is pretty normal test things. You see what it's doing. It's cloning the GitHub repo, switching to the right Perl version, and then just running through. We have the Perl version. Just runs the tests, our familiar output from prove, basically. And then it says it all worked. So that's nice. The equivalent of what that's doing by default is basically this. You have an install phase, which says install the prerequisites with CPAN-M. It doesn't run tests on them. And then for the test phase, it just runs the make file and then does a make test. Pretty basic. So that's the equivalent of the default, which isn't always enough. You might want to extend that some. So for example, have it report the build log from CPAN-M if it didn't work. So if some of the prerequisites failed, by default, CPAN-M will give you a message saying, hey, go check the build log. So you have to kind of manage that on your own in the Travis setup. You can also not use that kind of default setup. You could say, you can install your prerequisites manually and have them be tested fully, and then just run prove yourself instead of if you didn't want to run a makefile, or maybe you don't have one, if it's not a standard module. Also getting into things like distzilla. If you're using a tool other than just having a makefile in your repository, and you use distzilla, which is based on a dist ini file, then you have to set that up as well, or build based on that. You can also do, the build matrix, as it's called for this, can be rather complicated. You can specify different environment variables paired with different Perl versions, and a number of other switches that you can combine to basically get kind of an arbitrary setup and do a lot of different builds all at once. You could also, there's a couple kind of choices here. By default, Travis uses a containerized system and you don't have sudo access. It does have a way to specify packages that you want to install, apt packages. But not every package is going to be available, and you might need something that's, say, not in the default list, where you have to add a repository yourself. So it is possible to ask for sudo instead and use that to kind of set up a thing arbitrarily. With sudo, though, it does use a kind of different setup that is, the machines are slower and there's less capacity for them. So if you're running a lot of tests or a lot of different test setups, it'll take longer because you get like 2 at a time. So that's configured relatively simply by using the apt add-on or just saying, yes, I want sudo. It actually will automatically it'll give you the sudo setup if one of your commands in the YAML file is to run sudo. It just does that automatically for you. So there's a lot more stuff kind of in Travis. There's things like allow failures, which allows you to set up builds that you don't expect to always pass. Maybe you just don't care about them, or maybe they're like coverage tests that are going to be a lot slower and you want results faster. So you say, I don't really care about if this passes altogether, but still you want to run it. There's a cache feature, so you can have it cache files from disk but to the next run, so you can have prerequisites installed and then not have to reinstall them again. And any number of notification setups, some of the examples listed here, email, IRC, HipChat, Slack, there's a bunch of others that it has as well. As far as integration with GitHub, we see on a PR, it automatically has these tests that were run, and it says, yes, the PR passed, the push passed, and then you also get submitted coverage reports. And so that is all saying, and 2 of these are marked as required. This is actually a PR on Meta CPAN that we require the test to pass before it allows us to merge things. You can also see an example of one that's failing. So there's other things that are less easy to do, or it's a lot more work to do with this. So testing on, say, Perl 588, because by default it gives you 589, which never really was used by many people in the wild. So, or if you want again, more specific versions like 510, you want a debugging build, you want to test with bleed or a dev release. Or if you're a silly person like me and test on 5.6 sometimes. So I wrote this project, which is Travis-Perl Helpers, which is basically a set of scripts to do a lot of stuff that is common on Travis setups and do it for you. So the first is build-perl, which gives you kind of an arbitrary Perl that you asked for. And the second is build-dist, which is to convert a Git repo into a testable dist. And this is set up with just a relatively simple, some scripts that you clone and then do the init, or I have a little shortcut thing. Because evaling things from curl is always fun. So build-perl, how does this work? We just stick the command in there after our setup. And what it does is you specify Perl versions in the same location, just the same list as before, but the things it allows you to specify are more detailed. You can request a particular release of like again, 588 instead of just getting the normal 589 that it gives you. Or 526, they have 526 now, but it always takes them a bit to get that available on their systems after a release. And so being able to request that ahead of time, it can be good. They're way better about that than they used to be. It used to take them many months. Now it's like pretty quick. But you can also request bleed or dev, which is the latest dev release that was done. So right now that would be 527.0, right? Yeah. Or you can also add these little flags on the end, like saying, I want a threaded release. And there's a number of flags that I kind of stuck in there. One is for debugging, one is for threading. There's a couple others. So part of what this does is, if you give it a 3-part version, it gives you a Perl that doesn't have any extra prerequisites installed, which can be useful. By default, Travis installs a bunch of modules, which is good for speed, but not always good for your actual test coverage. And also, I pre-built a whole bunch of versions that it'll just download for you from my setup, which is ugly and I need to fix. But anyway, one weird caveat with this is it kind of initially looks like it failed when you try to use one of these versions, but it just continues going anyway, and then my stuff fixes it later. So that's fun. It looks kind of ugly and it confuses people, but it works well enough, so I haven't gone to any other way of doing it. So some other less easy to do extensions are dealing with, again, the fact that there's pre-installed prerequisites on these machines. Or another example is installing author deps. Like if you're using Distzilla and you first install Distzilla so that you can package your thing to test it, now you have all of Diszilla's prerequisites installed, which means if you depended on Moose without actually listing it in your metadata, your tests would all pass, even though your setup isn't really doing the right thing. Or so if you wanted to run Distzilla on 5.8 or 5.12 now, because it doesn't do that anymore. So if you have a thing that you want to package with Distzilla and you want to run your tests on older versions of Perl, that's harder to do with this kind of setup. So I have this other thing, which is build-dist, which takes the repo and turns it into a dist like you would have on CPAN, basically. So it uses a separate Perl. It uses actually the newest Perl it can find on the machine to do this. And it installs all the prerequisites kind of magically for you, but in a separate location, so that when you later try to use your tests, that won't be installed. This usually ends up actually being faster because of the combination of things with the setup, so even though you might think it would be slow. All of the major author tools, it kind of handles for you automatically, and it seems to do a pretty good job at this point, so I'm satisfied with that. So how does this look? Well, you run the build-dist command, and then it populates this variable of where it stuck it, and you can just cd into that directory. And now you're in a directory that looks a lot like the main repo, but it's a fully built dist. It has all of the meta.json file, the manifest file, all the kind of things you would expect to see in a full release. Again, it handles every kind of, it's the equivalent of a diesel build or a make dister or a build dister, basically, with additional handling as is appropriate. So it automatically handles all of the author deps, either by running the author deps tool in Diszilla's case, because it has that, or it just tries to run the makefile.pl and parses the error messages that come out of it until it can get a working setup. So of course, that's not always perfect, but it hasn't been a problem so far. It also handles module install, which I just went and found a list of all the module install commands by looking on what was available, and it just knows what they are based on what's in the makefile. Because that's the only way you can really do it. And it handles build.pl similar. It just parses error messages until it gets a working setup, which is amusing, but seems to work pretty well. So some other helpers that are in here. CPAN install, it's basically CPAN-M, but it has some extra little additions to it. It has a coverage option, which basically installs the appropriate modules for doing test coverage, and that's controllable by an environment variable. It works out pretty well in terms of putting that into your matrix. It automatically shows error logs on failure, so it doesn't pollute your output with all of the build for your prerequisites. until one of them actually fails, and then it automatically does, shows you that output. It's basically the same thing as I showed earlier, except it does it for you. It works on 5.6, which CPAN-M does not. Again, if you're silly enough to do 5.6 all the time, then you can, that'll actually work and handle all the same kind of prerequisite things that you would see on newer tools. And it also, like, it only installs, it installs developer prereqs, but only for your module itself. It doesn't, like, recursively install those, which is kind of the way CPAN-M picks its dependencies. The way you control that is, but you tell it, like, install suggested modules, install recommended modules, but it does that recursively for all of the prerequisites and their prerequisites, which usually isn't what you want for this kind of setup. So one of the things I mentioned there was coverage. And so I have a thing in here for setting up coverage pretty easily. Basically, we run a command to install our coverage dependencies. And in this case, I'm configuring it to use CodeCov. There's several sites for showing coverage output, and this is one of them. And it's what I'm using on a couple of projects. Coveralls is another one that's been used a bunch, but I still can't figure out how to get them to stop spamming my PRs with comments, even though I've disabled it any number of ways. But it still happens, so I stopped using them. So now we have a coverage setup and a coverage report command. And again, the CPAN install coverage option and the coverage setup and the coverage report are all conditional on that environment variable. So it's easy to put that environment variable in your build matrix and say, have one that, yes, I do want to do coverage, and then the rest not. So those are just no ops if you don't have it enabled, basically. There's a number of other things in here. One is test jobs. It basically just returns a number that is how many jobs you should run parallel, which is based on the number of CPUs it finds, and also it's 1 if coverage is enabled because devel cover doesn't work parallel. Or sometimes it looks like it works, but it doesn't actually. There's another that's test ders, which is it just returns T and XT if the author testing is set. It's just a little minor thing, but it's useful. Test files is recursively all of the test files in your T or XT directory, again, based on author testing. But it has a way to segment these, which is useful for coverage testing. Here's an example of segmented testing. This is what we do for Moose, where we have 4 different things configured in the matrix that are basically the same setup, but they're picking a different set of tests. And then we're using that test files and test jobs option in the prove call. So we say there's 4 options, and then we pick just out. Well, it's not specifically for speed, it's that it takes too long otherwise. If you look at the timing here on these 4, altogether, Travis has a 50-minute time limit on any given build. If you run over that, it just cancels it. So in this case, it would take too long if we ran all the tests in one run. This also does run them in parallel, so it can be for speed as well. The primary motivation for it, in this case, was just to not run over that limit. Because again, you can also configure these as allowing them to fail, so that although it will still report on what they are, it would go, as soon as it got the other results, it would mark it as passed or failed before it finished the coverage run. Which is, again, good for speed on reporting. There's another helper called local-lib, which basically just sets up a local-lib separate, which I mainly used this when I was writing the testing for local-lib itself, to separate out dependencies and such. There's a bunch of pre-built local-lib directories that have just sets of prerequisites. And you can actually specify that when you're picking a module version or a Perl version in the list of Perl versions you want. So all of these things kind of are useful on their own, but there's actually basically, they were meant to work separately. But there's a pretty common setup combining these that is just useful for a lot of projects. So I added this other thing that's auto mode. And it's basically just taking a setup that could look like this. That includes, we have some different build versions, or Perl versions in there that we need to use. And we have coverage enabled, but only for one particular build. We're testing also on bleed, but of failures, that kind of thing. So, but all of these commands that it's using are pretty, like, I would end up using that in a lot of projects. So instead, we simplify that to just one flag. Pretty useful as just kind of a base level thing that can be stuck on anything that gives you a lot more capabilities than what Travis does by default. So cross-platform testing is another part of continuous integration, though. Travis CI runs all of their things on Ubuntu by default. But what about other operating systems if you need to test elsewhere? Well, they also allow you to just run on, well, it's OS X is what you have to put in there. It's now macOS because they like changing names. But you can just list that as a separate operating system, and then it just is another thing in your build matrix. Question?
I know from my issues that I have need to test on previous. Do you know anywhere or how I can set that up?
So the question was if there's any way to set up testing on FreeBSD. I don't know of any publicly available continuous integration systems that run on BSD, but there may be one that's available. I don't know. Okay. Is that a free service or? Yeah. Okay. I have not used GitLab CI, so. OS X is one thing to test, but usually it ends up not, for most Perl things, it ends up not really being that different. It doesn't end up being a problem. But Windows is another question. Windows is more likely to cause problems. So there is another service that you can do Windows testing on, which is called AppVeyor. And it's very similar in a lot of ways to how you use Travis, but it's run on Windows. It's more designed for doing like .NET projects. It has a lot of things for dealing with the Microsoft Visual C compiler stuff and handling all of those packages. But you can also just kind of write arbitrary scripts that are run and use those for testing. So here's an example of using Moo, and because I do testing on that just to make sure it works. And we're testing on a number of different Perl versions, and some of them aren't working because the thing that I used to pick Perl versions doesn't work right now. Because they've changed a thing so it's checking certificates on the files, and these prepackaged Perl versions don't have the right certificate, so that's fun. I haven't fixed that yet. What you get for build output is, again, pretty similar. These are just the commands that I have set up to run, and it's just running our tests the same as it would anywhere else. And this is, again, on AppVeyor, they have a full UI. You can control everything through their UI. But I prefer to go with the approach similar to Travis, where you use a YAML file to specify everything in that. So this is what I'm using for Moo. We're specifying just a number of, again, we have a build matrix of where we want to test this. And then we have some commands. And of course, because this is the way I do things, I wrote a little helper thing that kind of does the switching for me of the different Perl types, which is, I still haven't decided if I want to package that in any way. Right now, it's just sitting in the Moo repository. But it basically handles switching between the different listed Perl types and trying to use the different versions of Strawberry Perl, which again is currently not working due to packaging issues of what's available on, I forget what the service is, but it's a Windows distribution system that you can install things from the command line. Yes. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, a lot of good examples of where to look, how to configure it are, we use this in Moose. Again, we use the coverage there and with the different different test partitions to get that all split out. I use this in Moo, which is kind of where I started out with trying to do all this testing across many different Perl versions. And again, I test Moo on 5.6 because, yeah. Oh, and Moose, again, is using Distzilla, so on that case, we want, again, all of the handling of having it configured via Distzilla, but testing on 5.8 and 5.10 and 5.12. Rolltiny is an example of just a really simple one. It basically is just the auto mode and that's it. But again, testing on 5.6 because, yeah. MetaCPAN Web, we use this, and that has a more complicated one. On MetaCPAN Web, there is, we use Carton for deployment, and so we have it set up to run the build both of Carton in deploy mode and also not in deploy mode. So we get a view of, if we use the exact same, the snapshot of prerequisites that it was last installed with, and test with that just to make sure, yes, it works and we can deploy it. But we also have a build run not using that, so it gets all the latest versions of everything, and we test against that just so that we know where we're going to be in the future when we next update the snapshot. I use this in local-lib, where again, I have to be very careful with the local-lib project about prerequisites and not using any, basically. So making sure that most prerequisites are not installed, including the base toolchain stuff, which is usually things you upgrade first, like xutils makemaker. I need to do testing on basically whatever shipped with Perl and make sure that that works and never upgrade it. And another thing here is DBIX class. DBIX class does not use any of my stuff. It has a totally different thing done by Ribasushi, and it is very extensive. Because of the nature of this, you can kind of do whatever you want with these. I have a particular way that I work. The helpers things that I've developed are kind of meant to be easy to use at a lot of places. With DBIX class, it has many more very kind of deep control over things and a lot more information reporting to make sure that it has more accurate information and is able to test in many different combinations of things that have been problems in the past. So if that's definitely a setup worth looking at, it's actually also pretty well documented, which is impressive for a bunch of bash scripts for doing continuous integration setup. So this is just some links. We have Travis CI and AppVeyor are the two main continuous integration things that I've used. And look at me on GitHub. And that's all I have. If there's any questions. Yep. Travis has pretty good documentation about how they're, what to put in the YAML file and how to configure that, and there's a lot more stuff that I didn't cover here about what it can do. So that's the main source of information about that side of things, and the rest of it is all Perl stuff that I've picked up along the way. Yeah. The documentation covers it covers all the like how to actually set up the build. The unfortunate thing with that is usually that the information you need just like it's information about the machines or things like that that you don't have unless you kind of search for it on the machines themselves. We don't. I mean, we could honestly. We have some communication with Travis, but not about that. They seem pretty approachable, is my understanding. As far as the way I do this, the thing is the machines have Perl brew on them, so that's basically a lot of what I'm doing with it is they just install another Perl, and so at that point you have kind of complete control. Any other questions? Yeah. 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 Yes. 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 Yeah, well yes, it does do that for each system, and actually, basically, you probably shouldn't carry. It's not like the amount of time that takes is usually a couple minutes. Like it doesn't. Well, usually what will end up happening is it will pick one of Travis's pre-built Perls, which already have Distilla. So it'll only need to upgrade the things that are listed as Distzilla version prerequisites in your dist-ini, etc. So that's why it often ends up being faster because of the Perl that it picks for that. It only takes like a minute or two to get those, and then it goes to your normal testing and that takes however long it needs to. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not quite clear on the question. Yes. The way that works is I have a script that is called test jobs, it is test files, and it basically just does find on your T directory. So it finds all of the tests in there and then splits them up based on in this case, or in Moose's case, it splits them in 4 because it's configured to split them in 4, and then it picks the first or fourth or etc., and it only runs that set of tests. It just specifies that list of tests to prove when it says to run them. Question? Yeah. I'm not sure if there's any like useful way to do that aside from obviously figuring out the failure and writing a test for it. The use case for CPAN testers versus continuous integration often ends up being different. Even though with these tools you can get coverage on, Linux, Mac, and Windows, and apparently BSDs and such, all of that, the actual the different systems you'll get reports for on CPAN testers are often more diverse or more strange. I get a lot of CPAN testers results that I just can't fix because it's just like Perl is broken. So the actual results you get are often just more diverse in a different way than is easy to qualify for this use case. Although like I say, I do have a setup for picking different build flags for Perl. That's often one of the things that becomes strange with access code and such, if you have like, there are many build flags that can make a difference in how those work. Oh, having a build, a bleed build fail send a ticket to like Perl bug saying that it's breaking bleed, or bleed is breaking this code. I wouldn't want to do that automatically because of the likelihood that just, like if bleed is broken at some point and then you get a result saying, bleed broke this module, and it's like, no, bleed just isn't working right now, which doesn't happen often, but it can. So, and it's also, although, yeah, I wouldn't trust doing that automatically, and also it seems a little like it wouldn't provide enough information. The nature of things like this is usually you're testing like as you push commits, and I don't know. It doesn't seem like it would work out particularly well. Question?
So, in order to speed up the installation process, I would consider Dash that will be on the Travis.
Yeah, you basically, if you can list in the Travis YAML file a directory to cache, and then for that like matrix entry, it will store that. Travis themselves will store that and restore it the next time it runs a test, so that you can have your prerequisites, keep them there, and not have to install everything again. There is some stuff that I want to do to make that work a little better in terms of what I do in the helpers, but I have not at this time done that. Anything else? I don't. It's associated with the repository and the matrix entry, basically. No other questions?